Grief is real, big, better shared. The podcast everyone needs to hear, but nobody wants to hear.
I'm Kevin Lee, President and CEO of Mid-America Transplant, and we are honored to sponsor this episode of Grief is real, big, better shared. At Mid-America Transplant, we have the privilege of working with families across southern Missouri and northeast Arkansas who make the heroic decision to donate their loved ones' organs or tissues. While donation often brings families comfort, they are still heartbroken by their loss. We are driven by compassion for these families and continue to walk with them through their grief journey. Mid-America Transplant provides several programs to help families memorialize their loved one, but we believe that some of the best support can be provided by a grief center. We are proud to work with the Center for Good Grief and appreciate everything they are doing in the region to bring healing to people who are coping with loss. Mid-America Transplant is inspired by life and by the donor families who give transplant patients a second chance at life. For more information about being a donor, visit sayyesgivelife.org.
Hello, welcome to Grief is Real, Big, Better Shared, the podcast everyone needs to hear, but nobody wants to hear. I'm Angela Hamblin-Kelly, the administrator of the Baptist Centers for Good Grief, and we're so glad that you are tuning in today. If this is your first time checking out our podcast, please know that we have Season 1 available wherever you get your podcast. In Season 1, there's a lot of great content about grief in general, about spouse loss, men in grief, and important things to know about childhood and adolescent grief. So make sure you go back and catch up on those episodes. With Season 2, we've heard from you and we listened to you, and we're going to focus more on some specific topics in a very short format. Just as a reminder, the Baptist Centers for Good Grief has been providing grief care for over 25 years. We've grown from a children's grief camp to a program with 3 comprehensive grief centers in Tennessee and Arkansas. We started this podcast because grief is the most universal experience there is. Again, this is the podcast everyone needs to hear because grief involves pain and vulnerability, which is also why this is the podcast nobody wants to hear. So I sit here today as a grief counselor, but I'm also a griever. So in our podcast, we hope to honestly look at grief and discuss the heart and head tug of war from an evidence-based grief counseling perspective, but also the very real-life perspective as well. So today we thought we would start with one of the most common questions that we're asked, which is, I'm grieving, now what? That's a really big question and a really big topic to cover in our podcast, short here today. But there are some really specific and certain things that I think people should start with, that it would be helpful for those new grievers to kind of start with and give themselves permission. So to conquer this topic today, I'm joined here with Carolyn, one of our grief counselors. Carolyn, thanks so much for being here today.
Thank you for having me.
So Carolyn, I'm grieving, now what?
Yes. Ooh, talk about a big topic.
Right.
That is a big topic.
And sometimes we will get calls from people who are leaving the hospital, who are headed to the funeral home. And that's what they'll say. Now what? What am I supposed to do? And I think a lot of that comes from just what grief is this loss that has happened. I didn't ask for it. Everything is changing. I feel like I'm in a different land. I'm in a world I don't recognize. Nothing is familiar. And there can be panic that comes with that. Like, what in the world am I supposed to do now?
Yes. And I think that, sometimes it feels like you said, people will call on their way home from the hospital or from the hospice house or something, because it feels like a crisis, like an emergency, something that we can do to fix it right now. And I think that's one of the hardest parts is that that's what it feels like. It feels like a crisis situation, like you have to do something right now, because what can I do?
Right.
But it's not quite that simple. It's complicated, and it's not something that we can give you a checklist of 12 things to do that is going to make it all better.
Right. But there are some things to start with. It is important to reach out for immediate support. Who is somebody who can just immediately be with you and support you, help you think through who are all the people we need to call. Sometimes just that can be overwhelming with who do I need to call? How do I make plans? Like, how does that even happen? Where do you start? Do I call the funeral home? Do they call me? Thinking through, is there going to be a burial? Is there going to be cremation? Is there going to be a service? And a lot of times those types of things just feel like, oh my gosh, I'm supposed to have an answer right now for that. And I think sometimes people need to know that it doesn't have to happen tomorrow. Take some time, have a trusted friend or family member that you can lean on to think through these things so that you make choices and decisions that you can feel good about, But there are those kind of immediate things that do have to happen. And also, if there are children involved, how do we talk to children? How do we explain this to them? A lot of times, because the adult is just deep in their own shock and disbelief, sometimes can be really confused about how do I explain this to children, especially if it's a complicated death. And so sometimes they won't tell kids the truth, or they'll tell them another story. And so I think in situations like that, it is definitely absolutely necessary and appropriate to reach out to a professional for how do I handle these steps? I'm on the way to school now to pick up my kids. What do I do? How do I tell them? And we're going to actually have another podcast where we're going to talk about that, kind of those specifics for telling kids. But kind of after those first steps of the phone calls and the plans and the services, then there's another wave of, well, now what?
Yeah, the funeral's over. The casseroles have quit coming. The cards have quit coming. People aren't checking in on me as much. Yeah, what do I do now? Because the feelings haven't gone away. They've intensified a lot of times. And people feel like they're sometimes grieving, in isolation because maybe that support is not there as much as it was before.
And I think we have to understand what grief is. There are so many misconceptions in our culture, so many myths. And, one of our first podcast is called Grief 101. And I would encourage listeners to go and listen to that. Like, we have to have that understanding of what grief is, because you are now grieving. You need to know what exactly that means. So I would really encourage people to listen to that, when you're trying to figure out kind of that now what.
Yes, that's the basics of grief. And it's the things that we've found are kind of the commonalities and common things in grief that we've seen over the years with people that they experience universally.
And also when you're in that fresh grief of the now what, a lot of times we're so focused on just the shock and numbness, and I really am grateful for those feelings. Now, personally, when I felt them, they're not my favorite. They're no one's favorites, but they're so purposeful, and they have so much meaning. I really do think they help us, survive those first couple of days, weeks, even months of figuring out what in the world is happening, all of the losses that are coming, because when we lose someone we love, there are other losses, other secondary losses. So as we are faced with those, that shock and numbness really helps us survive. And so I have a lot of gratitude for those emotions. So if that's where you are right now, understand that it has a purpose and that you're not always going to be there, but that it does have a purpose in these first couple of days, weeks, and even months.
Yes, it protects us, gives us a chance to heal, a chance to cope with some things that maybe we've never experienced before. And so your body knows that, and your body can kind of shut down sometimes. And like you said, but that's purposeful.
And with that, when that's happening, is that mindfulness of your body in these first few days, weeks, and months, meaning make sure you're eating. Make sure you're having some balance of nutrition. Sometimes I know a lot of people just don't feel like eating. They have no appetite. And so that might be more where you need to, be maybe having a shake, kind of like a meal replacement shake, so that you're getting some proteins and some nutrients, because your body needs that. Your body needs that food for fuel to help you grieve, even though you're not running a marathon. Kind of emotionally and even mentally you are when you're grieving. Watching your sleep, making sure that you are sleeping. And for a lot of grieving people in the beginning, that doesn't mean going to bed at night and sleeping 8 beautiful hours and then waking up. It might be intermittent sleep. It might be napping. And I hear from a lot of people, I'm not a napper. Your body needs rest in the beginnings of grief.
Yeah, and I always tell people this is a marathon, not a sprint. And so there's a cumulative effect to these things, and grief can affect us greatly physically, and especially in the early days of our grief. And so, you might could manage okay on less sleep for a week, 2 weeks. But as months go by with less sleep or not eating right or not getting exercise or those kind of things, it has a cumulative effect. And so we have to be very intentional about it. As you said, even if it's not what we feel like doing.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. I think too, I'm grieving now what? I would really encourage people to look at their support. And I think support can be hard when you're grieving, because sometimes you quickly see maybe who you thought would be supportive is not supportive, or people who are showing up for you you're surprised by. So I think sometimes support, it can be hard as well to kind of identify who those people are. But I think it's important to understand that the healthiest grievers and mourners that we've seen are people who allow support in, and who are willing to ask for support, who are willing to let people help them, but kind of knowing and beginning to identify who those people are. And sometimes, it may be support from other places, right? Like I hear so many people talking about support they find through social media, maybe Facebook pages or things that are directed towards loss, and things like that.
Yes, and we tend to sometimes think all of our support is wrapped up in one or two people, maybe a best friend, a spouse, a parent, a child. And typically that's not the case. What you're going to need from one person is going to probably be different from someone else. So, establishing what those needs are. I need someone who can just listen to me. I need someone who can just sit with me, someone to do some errands for me, some tangible things, because I just don't have the energy to do it right now. I need, someone that I can laugh with to give me that release and that distraction that we need also in our grief. So determining what those needs are, and then looking at the people in your life and finding who those are, because that person that's going to give you that laugh is probably not going to be the same person that's going to sit with you while you cry.
Right.
And that's okay. Everybody has a different relationship and serves a different area of support, and that's okay. But we have to figure out who those are, and then exercise that muscle of asking for help, and then more importantly, receiving it when it's given.
You just reminded me of a friend when I was grieving. I was so proud of him. He just said, look, you know how much I care about y'all, but I don't think I'm a good listener. It made me laugh, actually. But he's like, grief scares me. But let me tell you what I can do. I am willing to go to the grocery store. I'm willing to let your dog out. And just gave me a list. And I thought that was great. And I did. When he walked away, I felt so supported and cared for. And it was great. So I think that's important too. What you just said is that you're going to get that support from different people.
Yes, that's great. Yes.
So we're going to actually do another podcast in the future about this. But I think it is important to talk a little bit about when you're thinking, okay, I'm grieving, now what? Is understanding about dosing grief. A lot of times when we've had a death and we've had a service. It's all consuming. It's all we think, feel. It's just all. And then we sort of, I've heard people say, well, I feel like this is what I'm supposed to do now. I'm just supposed to be in this. Where really we know that for healthy grieving and mourning, it involves this concept of dosing grief. And Carolyn, do you want to talk a little bit about dosing and what that looks like?
Yes, I think we do kind of feel like we have this all or nothing response. We either want to totally run for our grief, avoid all the feelings, or we want to just be in it completely 24/7. And frankly, it's just too intense to be in 24/7. We need to lean into our grief. We need to feel it in order to heal, but we do have to step towards it, step away from it. And so we talk about dosing our grief, and it's very much like when the doctor gives you medication. He does not want you to take the entire bottle in one day. He gives you a prescribed dose. Then he wants you to take a little bit each day for a prescribed period of time. And it's very much the same with your grief, is you need to set aside time each day to deal with it, to open it up, to see what you feel, to be aware of your feelings, to scream, to cry, to do whatever you need to do to feel your grief and to tend to your grief. But then be able to put it away and step away for a moment by, going for a walk or talking with a friend or doing some activity that you enjoy. We need to have release from that as well. And so finding a way to do that dosing, to experience it a little at a time throughout our grief journey can be so important.
And that dosing can fall into a safety category too. For example, a lot of people talk about being so distracted by their grief when they're driving. And so sometimes that's a place I'll get people to start practicing with dosing is when they get in the car, starting the car, don't put the car in reverse or drive, leave it in park, and say, right now, I'm going to drive to work. I'm going to put my grief over here in the passenger seat because it's still with you. But my grief needs to sit there. I need to think about driving to work.
Yes.
And that can be kind of a way when you're freshly grieving is learning this concept of dosing is really having to do that. And I'm not kidding, leaving the car in park and saying that out loud. And then putting the car in drive and going to work. And then when you get to work or wherever you're going, your grief is going to go with you, but we have to have these moments of dosing or containment, sometimes for safety, like physical safety, but then other times for that emotional safety, like you were talking about, having a break from the intensity. And maybe that's just dosing of, I'm going to go outside and I'm going to take a couple of deep breaths, or I'm going to go on a walk, that kind of thing. That really can be a survival skill for those who are freshly grieving is sometimes just to have the permission to know that dosing is okay.
Yes. And I think one advantage of it too is it doesn't mean that we can manage it or control our grief, but it does mean that if you are tending to your grief every day, it doesn't have as much of a likelihood for it to build up to this point that it just explodes everywhere. And, we hear people say, something happened and triggered them. And it does. That's going to happen. We're going to have those triggers that cause us to have these grief bursts and these intense emotions. But by focusing on our grief a little bit each day, sometimes that can kind of reduce that intensity so that maybe it's not right there on the surface ready to blow at any time.
Right. Absolutely. And I think too, other safety things to keep in mind when we're freshly grieving, because especially if this is your first loss, or if it's if you've had multiple losses, this is the first time you've grieved for this person, it can feel very overwhelming. The emotions can be so intense. So remembering that you're not alone. There are resources if you are in distress. Again, going back to that support, knowing who you can call on if you are feeling hopeless, if you are feeling so much loss of meaning, what's the purpose? Those can be very normal feelings in grief. That is part of the loss we experience, is loss of meaning, but it can be very scary when you feel it at such a level of intensity. So even though it's normal, we also want people to know that it's important to reach out.
Yes. I tell people a lot, these are normal responses, but it sure doesn't feel normal.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And safety is important, and knowing that this journey, like you said, is a marathon, but that we need support to do that.
Yes.
Like we said, hopelessness, lack of joy, loss of meaning, those are common experiences with grief. But I think if you're feeling that at such a level of intensity and maybe even having, suicidal thoughts of self-harm, harm to others, it is important to see that as this is something that needs immediate assistance and support.
Yes.
And we have the 988 hotline that anyone can call when they are feeling those suicidal thoughts, feeling like that they're a danger to themselves. That is very important to us. And that's a very hard, complicated part of grief, especially fresh grief, is we can feel that way. Absolutely, you can feel that way. And that doesn't mean that you are suicidal. But that's something that I think really deserves the attention and talking through with a counselor to see, is this my grief, or is this more serious in terms of needing some other assistance. But that 988 is a hotline that is always available and open to people, and I think that's important for people to know.
Yes, wonderful resource, because I think with that, when we're having any thoughts in that direction, erring on the side of caution is always important. Plus, it's always going to feel supportive to talk to someone about what you're feeling, and ease your mind if you're concerned about yourself, and to get someone else's opinion and advice in that situation.
And I think it's important too, as you're listening to this, we say a lot, these are normal, common reactions. And you may be sitting there thinking, but it doesn't feel normal and common. It's the most abnormal thing. And I can tell you, as a grief counselor, with the years of experience I've had that same talk with myself when I've been grieving. I've had to say, this is normal. It doesn't feel normal. It's normal. It's normal. And really had to spend time with that feeling and emotion. I've had to pick up the phone and call someone and talk about it. So even though we say that, we also very much understand it doesn't feel that way.
Right. And just because something is normal doesn't mean that we don't need support with it. But they are responses we expect people that are grieving to experience. But it can feel very overwhelming, because a lot of times some of the different reactions you have are contradictory. And so that can make us feel also very much like this is not normal.
Right. And I think that leads to an important point when we're grieving. How do we know if we need grief counseling? Because not everyone needs grief counseling when they're grieving, but everyone needs support.
Yes.
Everyone needs opportunities for expression and memorialization. And so I'm grieving, now what? That's something to really think about as well, because again, all grievers need support, need opportunities of expression and memorialization. And some people need grief counseling for various reasons, but support is needed by all grievers.
Right. And sometimes that support is in the way of counseling, because as we've talked about in previous podcasts, that you can have a huge family and network of friends and not have the support you need. So it's important to make sure you do have that support in whatever capacity that comes in. But counseling is definitely a wonderful resource to have, and also is different for each person too. Some people might need a couple of sessions. So for them, the now what might be a couple of sessions to kind of normalize their grief, to make sure they're taking care of themselves, to make sure they're focusing on good coping skills. And they may not really need anything else because they have that support in their lives. Other people may not have any support, may not have had good coping skills, may not be taking good care of themselves, and need that assistance for a longer period of time to help them with their grief.
Absolutely. And I think, too, I hear from a lot of new grievers, I went and bought every grief book, or my friends gave me every grief book. I know I should be journaling. I also should be doing this. A lot of shoulds. So I think we have to be careful with the shoulds. I think that a lot of times when you are, I'm grieving, now what? It's hard to focus and concentrate on a book. It's hard to read. We have some recommendations that we usually give people, and a lot of times I'll say, because this is something that can be read kind of in bite-sized kind of chunks. It's not overwhelming. You cannot read 30 chapters on grief overnight. I mean, your brain just can't. So those steps will come. When you are grieving and you are doing your grief work, that kind of stuff will come, especially if you're in grief counseling. We'll talk about other ways of expression, maybe through journaling or, art, music, reading things, but you can't necessarily do all of that in the beginning. You just don't have the space to take that all in, because you're really so focused on kind of just your basic needs of surviving these first few days and weeks. Mm-hmm. And so that's really important to remember. Don't set yourself up for all these expectations that I should be reading I should be doing all this journaling every day.
Yes, you don't need additional pressures on yourself. Yeah. And so I think one of the most important things you can do for yourself when you're grieving in the what next is just allow yourself to be where you are. Everybody's journey is going to be different. And just allowing yourself to be where you are each day. Take that day on its own and deal with what's in front of you, and then move forward the next day, but not putting all those expectations of where you should be right now, how you should be experiencing this, what you should be doing in order for your grief. A lot of the work with your grief is really not about doing; it's about sitting in it. It's about putting yourself in neutral and just allowing yourself to be there, which is one of the hardest things.
And I think that's the perfect place to end with, I'm grieving, now what? Again, there are very specific things that sometimes have to be done in the very, very, very beginning. And then we hope that these things have helped you, kind of think about navigating those days and weeks and months beyond funeral services and things like that. And I think just most important, give yourself grace for where you are. Know that support is critical. And seek that support and help.
Yes.
Grief does heal. Let me say that again. Grief does heal. But like we've said, grief demands attention and care. It also needs support and patience. Remember that your grief is a reflection of your love. You are not alone. The world is full of many grievers like you. You can learn more about us at www.baptistgriefcenters.org. You can check out our YouTube channel, Baptist Centers for Good Grief. You can check out our podcast wherever you get your podcast. Also, know that you can reach out and let us know if there's a topic that you're interested in learning more about. You're welcome to email me at angela.kelly@bmhcc.org. That's angela.kelly@bmhcc.org. And remember, grief is real, big, better shared. We'll talk soon.